We're going to be investigating the rise and fall of empires. Specifically, we're going to understand how empires fall, and then how colonies are conquered, and how the roles persist today. We'll be looking at four different resources primarily. The first of these is Doom, The Politics of Catastrophe by Ferguson. Historical Dynamics, Why States Rise and Fall by Turchin. Collapse, How Societies Choose to Fall and Succeed by Jared Diamond, who we've spoken before about in this class. And finally, by William Easterly, The White Man's Burden. So to begin with, we can take a look at Ferguson, who is probably the most conservative of the four authors. His interests lie primarily in patterns and systems that emerge in catastrophes throughout human history, right? So he begins by investigating things like floods and earthquakes and volcanic eruptions, specifically those which destroy entire cities or entire city-states. And then he also looks at things like wars, famines, plagues, and the like. And so some of these things are very natural kind of catastrophes, and some are human-made. However, regardless of whether they're natural or human-made, he's interested in how societies react and then overcome those catastrophes. So even in the wake of natural tragedies, according to Ferguson, humanity is often an accomplice, either helping to cause or escalate a disaster, or worse, reacting to it in damaging ways. And so he argues that the most disasters and human failures lack any meaning, right? So there's no reason these things happen. They just happen. They're often haphazard, chaotic, or random, but there's no inherent meaning to why, right? So he's not interested in like the causes of evil or anything like that. He's more interested in, here are these things, they're terrible tragedies, and how do people overcome them, and how do people cope? So even though we can say that humans don't cause floods or earthquakes or volcanic eruptions, at least not in ancient history, there are some root causes that certainly exasperate those issues. First and foremost, Ferguson's very critical of institutions or groups who have kind of an inertia or their an inability to react. They're unable to move or make needed changes, right? So they become kind of stuck in their ways. He's also critical of groupthink. So this idea of like mob mentality sort of taking over and people only doing it or saying things because other people are doing it and they just want to go along with the crowd. He's also critical of mediocre managers. So that could be actual managers like in corporations, but it could be managers within the bureaucracy of a government, right? And he's critical of them who have maybe perverse incentives, right? So are looking only out for themselves, or worse, maybe in some cases where they just shirk difficult decisions and they put that onus on somebody else's shoulders. So a lot of current issues are for like post-imperial sort of nation states, especially places like the U.S., are things like hubris, right? That arrogance that talks about, I'm the best and unable to have any humility. But also this kind of new mood of intellectual pessimism. So it's kind of in vogue right now to be pessimistic and to support that pessimism with some kind of intellectualized, rhetoric. Um, Ferguson thinks that empires actually were stabilizing forces throughout history, so he's critical of people who distrust empires. We're going to talk more about different theorists who see the negatives of empire. To give Ferguson credit, he doesn't simply say, oh, all empires were good forces in the world. He recognizes that they were certainly problematic, but he believes that the stabilizing forces of specifically the British Empire provided benefits throughout the world, things like transportation and communication, like telegraphs and those kinds of things, economic reforms and the use of natural resources. He sees those as positive forces. Like I said, the other three authors we're going to look at can see those as more negative. Ferguson believes that there's a natural life cycle to empires in which global powers today still kind of fulfill that role. So he argues that what's the difference between an empire and the five Security Council members of the UN, right? So, Great Britain and France and Russia, right? How come, and us, the US and China, how come they're considered not empires when they function the same way? They function just like the empires of old. And so he argues that at least those five powers, specifically superpowers themselves, they occupy what we would call an imperial force, and so are in the life cycle of empires. He argues that although you can't say specifically an empire will have this length of success, or that there's the cycle of growth and decline, and those processes are going to follow this exact path, and that they all differ by country. But he sees a general kind of rise, peak, and fall that spans around 350 years. And so we're going to have to ask this question: if the US occupies an imperial sort of power in the world today, and they have a 350 year life cycle, where are we then in that life cycle, and how much longer do we have before a great catastrophe befalls us? From a similar but certainly different point of view, similar in the sense that we're looking still at large kind of demographic statistics. Turchin is also going to study social, political, economic, and demographic factors when it turns into or concerns things of the rise and fall of empires. But unlike Ferguson, who really just kind of does an analysis of history, Turchin's going to use mathematical models. And so what he does is he creates these statistical models and these mathematical models. It inputs data, specifically demographic data and geopolitical data, and then he uses that to understand where a country is and where the nations are and where the globe is completely, right? So he kind of maps out like the geopolitical dynamics. He looks at factors that are affecting sort of a collective solidarity. So do people feel like they belong? He looks at issues of ethnic assimilation and religious conversion. So the pressures that groups might feel to adopt or become part of a major group, especially if they're a minority group. And then he looks at like the interactions between population change and socio-political stability, right? So as population changes, stability sort of erodes. And so he looks at how those two factors kind of play against each other. So his four major criteria that he kind of focuses upon are population, the structure of a state, how the elites behave and believe where their role is, and then just the general instability of a nation state. So population can be defined in terms of the number of people, but also the differing age groups. And so like which generations are there, right? So for instance, a lot of Eastern countries like China and Japan have a growing aged population, but a decreasing young population. So those would be things that you'd be looking at. Urbanization and mobility. So how groups are moving out of rural areas and moving into more city areas. And then also this idea of the overall social optimism. So how do people feel about being a part of their country, right? He looks at the state and how it's organized and its structure, and then specifically looks at the revenues versus the expenses, right? So is the state taking in enough revenue through tax dollars to cover the expenses of infrastructure and services? He looks at the elites, so the income and wealth distribution. So, and that can also translate to power because wealth and power are often intertwined. He also looks at how consumption of resources are used, right? So are the elites using more resources than are needed? Is there a disparity then for the non-elites? And then also this idea of like the intra-elite cooperation, so the intra-elite helping one another maintain their elite status, and are they creating out groups that can't access elite status? And finally, how power and wealth is consolidated in small groups of people. Lastly, he looks at the instability. So radical ideologies erode stability of nation states. Terrorism, both domestic and international, can erode the stability of a nation state. And then finally, if there are uprisings and civil war, certainly there's a high level of instability then. From here, he creates his models, which kind of look like either weather system models, so like the same kind of models that you see when people are trying to predict the weather, or earthquake models, right? So like kind of using like seismic data in order to predict how another event might take place, or look at the pressure to see when it might build to a large event like an earthquake, right? And so he looks at these empirical patterns, and then he sees that there's a predictability with a pretty high degree of accuracy. So for instance, taking these factors into account, he's able to kind of create these seismic charts. They kind of look like these big, large line graphs, and they show pressures building socially, culturally, and politically. And and then it builds towards like a maximum pressure, and we see really big spikes in approximately around the 1870s. So that's right when we were having U.S. was having its civil war, but there was also civil unrest around the world. And then approximately around 1920s, again, we have a lot of civil unrest happening, right? So this is right around World War One and the Great Depression, and those are not only national issues for the U.S., but they're global issues. And then he sees another spike around 2020. So we also saw some civil unrest across the world. We saw the Great Pandemic. We've also saw, large shifts in government kind of directions from all around the world in Europe and America. And so there's a lot of upheaval and maximum pressure at those major points. And so when he goes through these pressure points, he recognizes that there's a big predictor of instability in a nation is that when there's an ethno-nationalist solidarity, right? So what ethno-nationalist solidarity means is that like groups of people start to form and solidify over a nationalist sort of viewpoint of their identity and their ethnic identity, right? And so those two become conflated and they start seeing them as one. So if you're a true patriot or a true member of this group, you have to be a true member of this race or ethnicity as well. We can see that all throughout history where there's kind of a solidarity of groups where I'm the in group and you're the out group. We certainly saw this during World War II with the rise of fascist groups who also created out groups, specifically ethnic minority groups. In Germany and Russia, we saw that with the attack on the Jews. And we've seen it also throughout history in other places. In more recent history, we saw that with the rise and power of Milosevic and the issue of Serbian sort of descent. And we're seeing some of that right now, currently in the Ukraine. What happens is this ethnic kind of nationalist group then pushes a nation state into a much more aggressively expansive kind of model. So what that means is that the nation state becomes more aggressive and hawkish in its military and its foreign policy and starts to expand into other regions and conquer territory, right? Again, we're seeing that right now with Russia and its relations with the Ukraine. So kind of shifting gears, Jared Diamond doesn't look at it from a mathematical standpoint or even from, say, like a historical standpoint from a Western kind of dominant historical standpoint. But Diamond looks at indigenous populations specifically, and he looks at cultures that have risen to great, incredible power and then collapse pretty dramatically. So he looks at groups like the Mayans, the Easter Islanders, the Anasazi, the Fertile Crescent peoples, folks from Angkor Wat, the Great Zimbabwe culture. And then you could even toss in like ancient Greece and Rome and the Norse Age in Greenland and present day Montana. So there are some Western groups that he also takes a look at. What he finds is that from archaeological evidence, often these groups that we've listed right here were facing environmental problems, and those environmental problems lead to a civilization's collapse. Some societies are more fragile than others, because of their geography and because of their culture and society. So, for instance, he mentions how Japan is pretty stable geographically, and it has not collapsed as an entity, right? It's maintained its kind of consistency throughout its world kind of affairs. Even though it's suffered greatly through different wars, to this day it still remains Japan, right? Whereas Somalia, Rwanda, and Yugoslavia all collapse and they cannot make that same claim. And so there are obviously some groups which are much more fragile than others. Diamond makes sure that he wants people to know that there's really no single factor that can address collapse, right? So he might be more critical of folks like Ferguson who kind of point to specific kind of models, and it's kind of more Western way of looking at the world. Diamond tends to be a little bit more globalistic and holistic in his approach. And he argues there's no one root cause because there's a complex problem which requires complex issues. And so he kind of takes a step back and he says, okay, so if I wanted to look at what were the things that kind of led up to the fall of these indigenous groups, what were commonalities? What were some major themes? And so he has like a 5-point framework that he developed. And basically, if you can check all 5 of these boxes, that either leads to a collapse or explains a collapse that's already happened. So first and foremost, people start inadvertently destroying all of their resources. So basically, they start over consuming, and they get to the point where they can't stop over consuming because otherwise they'll die. And they start to trade their short term for long term interests. And we're going to talk about that in a second. But things like soil erosion and deforestation are big kind of indicators archaeologically, but also anthropologically in today's cultures, that if you have a society where the soil has eroded or there's too much deforestation, then the resources are being used at a rate that can't bounce back. Climate change is always an issue, right? And so climate change can be caused by human agency or it can be caused through natural cycles of the earth. Typically, an empire that's built during a period of climate change starts to suffer. This doesn't mean that it has to happen. He specifically cites the Iron Age Norse who were living in Greenland. As they were deforesting their area and they were abusing their resources, there was a push towards a colder climate during that time period, and that partially wipes out the Norse in Greenland. But the Inuit who live north of them not only do well, but they thrive, right? So climate change doesn't always cause a problem, but it certainly adds stressors if you've already consumed all of your resources. He then cites that oftentimes these groups will have failing relations or become more distant in their relations, especially with their allies. So things start to become stressed and they can't count on their allies anymore for whatever reason. It can be socio-cultural, it can be different, issues of different chiefs or whatever wanting, to take things in a different direction. But there's just a stress on that relationship and it's falling apart. Likewise, there's also an increasing contact with hostile neighbors. So again, using those Norse of the Iron Age, they continue to have a distant relationship with Norway. Their kind of, their original connection. It became more and more distant, more and more strained. So that's their allies. And because of that, they started having more interactions with the Inuit, but that was a more hostile. They were hostile towards one another. And so that increases a lot of instability. Lastly, there are a lot of political and social factors which become pessimistic and prevent solutions to environmental issues. So, for instance, people start believing, because of whatever reason, socially or politically, that they can't solve problems, then they actually can't solve their problems. And so Diamond draws a handful of conclusions from, if you can check off these 5 points in the framework, there are conclusions about what causes collapse and why groups, he argues, kind of choose to fall apart, right? So first off, collapses usually form right after a peak. So as a civilization peaks, there's not really a gradual decrease. Instead, there is a drastic fall, right? So for instance, he talks about the Mayans building, these massive pyramids and thriving economically, and then they just drop off the face of the earth, right? There's a huge crash that follows that. He argues that a lot of times humans kind of behave like a bacterial growth in a petri dish, and because we consume at such fast rates, just like bacteria do, it's a geometric rate. We overconsume, and so when we overconsume, that puts a lot of pressure on the society, and typically it collapses from the lack of resources. He also argues that there's some geographic luck in here. So this is a theory he proposed in others of his works, especially Gun, Germs, and Steel. But this idea that certain groups live in better geography, right? They have a better geography to live in. The resources are better. The natural disasters are limited. And so if you have geographic luck, that helps you. But if you're unlucky geographically, or if your geography turns because of climate change or natural disaster, and you become very unlucky, that puts an incredible amount of pressure on you, and that tends to lead to destruction. Oftentimes, there's a conflict of short-term interest of the elites with the long-term interest of the society as a whole, meaning that the elites start to see, well, I can take more resources very readily here. I know long-term this will destroy things, but in the short term, I'll satisfy my needs. And when elites start to make those choices, Diamond argues that's one of the biggest factors in what happens in kind of creating collapse. Also, because elites are often able to insulate themselves from catastrophe and collapse, because they can't insulate themselves, they often don't worry too much about what might happen to everybody else. And that, again, that short-term thinking is problematic. Lastly, and probably most importantly, is oftentimes groups who see doom on the horizon continue to choose that path because they're unable to adapt, right? So a question often comes up, well, why did the Easter Islanders cut down that last tree? Why did they completely destroy the entire island of its natural resources? And it's largely because if you wrap up your identity in your culture and your systems, in order to make changes to the way you live, you also have to change who you are. And that's oftentimes nearly impossible for a lot of groups and a lot of humans. So then the next kind of way to look at these issues of empire and colonial power, imperial power, and the colonies themselves is through William Easterly's theories that we are persisting in this. We're continuing these problems today, right? And so he starts with questions whether global powers of today who are using humanitarian aid to help developing countries, he wonders, is that any different than the imperial powers of yesterday trying to civilize the colonies, right? Is there any difference in these actions? He's definitely critical of what he calls the planner approach, in which the person already thinks they know how to solve poverty, famine, disease, and these things, and they go in with, I have the solution, as opposed to what he calls the seeker approach, in which their small solutions get developed to address parts of a problem along the way, and it's a much more discovery based. And Easterly argues that that's a much more organic and sustainable way of solving problems, as opposed to just coming in and trying to take everything over, which he argues is not much different than being an imperial. He states that the seeker believes that poverty is a complicated tangle of political, social, historical, institutional, and technological factors. And he also goes on to write that when we, especially out of the West, the US and European powers, when we go into, say, Africa or South America or parts of Asia, and we start to kind of exert what we're going to do to fix those countries and fix their problems, we are using white man's guilt now, this guilt over what we had done as imperial conquerors, as a kind of way of trying to cope with our original sin of what we did, but it becomes a white man's burden again, right? This idea that we have a divine responsibility to impose cultures and structures on the rest of the world, right? That was the white man's burden. And now we seem to be doing the same thing through our guilt. So he sees there's two major problems here, and these are the consequences of colonialism and imperialism. Extreme poverty and its effects throughout the world exist because of colonialism. And B, despite the West spending something like $2.3 trillion in aid, and that's actually an old figure, that's a figure from about 15 years ago. So that figure has increased dramatically. We keep dumping more money into it, and the problems still remain unresolved. It's sort of like our famine problem, where we produce enough food to feed everybody on the planet, but yet we can't get the food to them for a number of reasons. They might be social and political, they might be cultural, they might be economic, but whatever the reasons are, we are failing in getting this aid to the people that need it. And so he argues that to really find solutions, Western aid organizations have to incorporate the people who are being helped, right? They have to incorporate the people who need to be helped. That way they can be part of the problem or solution to address the problems. They want to be part of that solution and provide feedback and kind of the boots on the ground, so to speak, so that you are not just exerting things on people and telling people what to do, but we're working with people to solve those problems. He also wants to caution that world poverty is not a technical problem that the world's leading practitioners can solve. Instead, future solutions will be found by trial and error and a search for what works on the ground. And so he argues again that if people want to be helpful, they can't just donate to a large aid organization and be like, well, I've solved the problem, I can wash my hands of this. We need solutions that are developed in the area, in the region with the people that those solutions are trying to be aimed and targeted at. So there are some other issues that we can address. So there are some socially cultural issues that also point to collapse, right? So we've got these imperialistic or large global powers that still exist today, and many of them seem to be on the verge of collapse, especially if you look at things like Diamond and Ferguson and Turchin's models. They show the issues. And if you look at Easterly's kind of ideas, the tensions between developing and developed countries continue to be pervasive. So, what are the things that we can look at to help us understand if a culture or if a nation state might be on the brink of falling apart? And so there are these four kind of cultural things that we can deduce that when we start to see these are indicators that there are deep-rooted and deep-seated problems within the nation state or within the culture. The first of these is the issues of sex and violence, especially when sex and violence start to become conflated. When we start seeing the acts of sex and the portrayals of sex being more violent, and when we start to see the acts of violence be associated with arousal and sexual desire. When we start to see those two things conflate, that's a sign that cultures are starting to fall apart. We see this in Rome, we see this in ancient Greece, we even see this in cycles of the Mayan and the Aztec. So all throughout culture and throughout history, whenever we see this kind of hallmark where the sex and the violence become really heightened within the culture, it seems to be a reaction to the culture sensing its own doom and kind of being at its last ends of seeking some last ditch of pleasure before things fall apart. Another thing that you can look at is when a pessimistic leader or leadership starts to rise. So these pessimistic leaders start talking about how everything's going to fall apart, the world's going to end, everything's terrible, there's no way to fix it at this point, and they really just talk about how the end is near. What ends up happening is when a leader like that takes over control, it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy. They convince the people that that's true, and then the people end up acting that out and making that come to light. Because of that, oftentimes those leaders will then kind of focus on multiculturalism. So most societies, especially today, but all throughout history, have been multicultural, where cultures had to kind of come together and kind of cope with one another through war and through trade and through all these different kind of actions that bring folks together. And when multiculturalism kind of gets to its height, where people start accepting one another and kind of just work alongside one another, that's usually at the peak of an empire or a peak of a large dominant power. But as we talked about, oftentimes these powers fall very drastically. And when that's happening, your pessimistic leader needs someone to blame for that fall. And so oftentimes they focus on the other. They focus on another group, an ethnic group or a racial group or a religious group that's different than the majority, and they blame that minority for the downfall of society. When that starts to happen, we also start to see huge inequity in the wealth, right? So there's a huge inequity in distribution of wealth, where wealth becomes consolidated by the elites. They start to hoard things, and then the peasantry or the proletariat, or what you want to call the groups that fall below the elites, they start to get less and less and less. Again, Diamond pointed this out in his kind of like 5 hallmarks and his conclusions of what happens when an empire falls. So we can see that culturally as well. All right, so how bad is it? That's oftentimes a question I get from students, like how close are we as a society in the US? How close are we to having things fall apart? Well, it turns out there are, some pretty smart folks who are thinking about this and have been doing so for quite some time. The US government has sponsored a political instability task force. It's a task force that's been around for quite some time. It's a federal task force. And one woman who's on it, Barbara F. Walter, also wrote a book called How Civil Wars Start and How to Stop Them. And what this task force does, and some of the work that Walters talks about in her book, looks at how likely a country is to slip into instability, and how likely it is that would slip into something like a civil war, or civil unrest, or a revolution. right? And so what they do is they assess these variables in which a civil war might be likely. So the task force came up with 38 different variables that include things like population size and poverty and corruption, et cetera, right? And they look at these variables and they try to figure out, okay, so if we look at places that have gone through civil wars in recent histories, like Rwanda and Somalia and Yugoslavia, but also in ancient history and in more modern history, right? So you kind of look at it from a historical standpoint, and you look to see where these countries fall in these 38 variables. The goal is to be able to predict then how likely a country is to slip into an issue, right? And so you might look at things like, civil war is kind of a complicated way of defining things, right? So, for instance, our own civil war we've had here in this country wasn't actually called a civil war originally. It was called an uprising or a revolution or a rebellion. It wasn't called a civil war until later. For instance, our own revolution against England and Great Britain was characterized at once as an uprising, like a colonial uprising. It wasn't, so it was considered more of a civil war, but it was, say, a revolution. It wasn't until later in history that it was called a revolution. So you see these kinds of words being tossed around. Oftentimes they're interchangeable until we look at it back with kind of hindsight historically, and then kind of determine whether or not what's the best way to categorize things. But in one way, you could argue, one person's revolution is another person's civil war. It just depends on which side of the conflict you're on. So anyways, this task force looks at these 38 variables that different countries have gone through and can use those to build predictions about when a new country might fall into that same issue. Originally, it was thought it would be like these issues of ethnic problems or religious problems. It was also thought that poverty would be a huge indicator of when a country is on the brink of collapse. And it turns out, although those things are true for large empires and those kinds of things, that actually isn't the greatest indicator. The greatest indicator, according to the task force and Barbara Walter, is that it's called their polity score. So that means how democratic or how autocratic a country is. So it ranks the country from a -10, which is a complete autocracy, meaning that it's completely ruled by a single ruler, usually an inherited ruler. And the most autocratic country on earth today is Saudi Arabia, right? And then democracy is a true elected representation in government. And the most democratic country in the world today is Denmark. So this is the scale, right? The scale of polity. So autocracy on the far left, which is the Saudi Arabia -10, and Denmark and democracy on the far right, which is the +10 true democracy. Okay. So a lot of times people will think, oh, well, if you're slipping away from democracy into autocracy, that's when the revolution is going to start, or that's when the civil war is going to start. Yes, that's true, but it's not because the democracy is turning into an autocracy. It's the stages that get them there. And so there's a middle part, which is known as the anocracy. And the anocracy is part democracy and part dictatorship. And when a country is literally in that middle, that's the biggest indicator. That's the number one indicator on if a country is about to fall into a civil war, right? And it talks about how that country is unable to endure political instability. It turns out autocracies are very stable, just like true democracies are very stable. Autocracies, although we don't typically use one of those in this country because we don't believe in a single ruling family or a single ruler who inherits that and stays in power forever, sort of like a dictator or a king. We don't tend to follow that. A lot of countries that do follow that are very stable. Now, we can talk about, if there's equality in those countries and human rights and those kinds of things, but that's not the same thing as talking about their stability. That means how stable is the nation and how likely are they to weather political unrest. So it turns out Saudi Arabia and Denmark both equally would be able to weather political unrest. They just do it from different standpoints. That's not to say that we should be an autocracy. It's just to say that Saudi Arabia would also be able to weather those problems. Now, if Saudi Arabia or Denmark were starting to move across the scale towards one another, so Denmark was slipping into an autocracy or Saudi Arabia was slipping into a democracy, that's when the two countries become very unstable. Walter talks about, for instance, in Iraq and Afghanistan, when those countries were forced into democratic principles by the U.S., right? So, we kind of conquered those lands and then, imposed democracy on them, right? But they didn't generate democracy on their own. That's not to say what we did was wrong. It's just to say that they didn't self-generate that. It was imposed upon them. That's why those countries were very, very unstable. And we saw how unstable they were because as soon as the US pulled out of both those countries and did not monitor and maintain the governmental processes, both those countries fell apart, right? And so it's this movement that's the most dangerous for a country. So those that are most likely to dissolve into a civil war are shifting from an autocracy to a democracy or from a democracy to an autocracy, and they're nearing the anocracy. The anocracy is that weird blend of the two, which doesn't really work. And as they move from either side, that's the most dangerous place to be. Movement from an autocracy to a democracy is just as bad as democracy to an autocracy, right? And so we have to figure out how that would work. Because what ends up happening is, Walter talks about this, that if you start to make that movement, we are picking new winners and losers. Elites are going to start changing roles, right? If you overthrow an autocracy, those who used to be in power now no longer have power, but they still want their power. Or if you're moving from a democracy to an autocracy, the people are now losing and they want their power back, right? So it's that shift of power that creates new winners and new losers, which then creates the instability. So a major concern that Walter talks about is that when elected leaders begin to ignore their role, okay, so in an autocracy, this isn't as drastic of a problem, but definitely in a democracy. So when a democracy starts to no longer function like a democracy, and that democracy starts to move towards autocratic sort of principles, that's a really big, dangerous red flag. When those guardrails that were created as institutions to maintain and preserve democracy start to slip away, when we start to say things like, elections aren't important, or we can't trust Congress, or we don't want a strong Congress, we want a strong judicial group, right? Those are the guardrails that are meant to keep democracy in place. And if we start whittling those away and eroding those guardrails, that's when a new civil war starts to surface. Now, Walter also talks about what a civil war looks like in the 21st century. And she's like, it's not going to be the civil wars of the 1800s or even the early 1900s. These are going to be insurgencies, which means they're going to be grassroots domestic terrorists who undermine the fabric of the nation. That's how a civil war starts to work. It won't be massive armies colliding with massive armies. That won't be how this kind of blows up, right? And so she argues, watch out for those eroded democratic principles when things like democracy itself start to fall apart, or when leaders say we don't need democracy, trust me instead, or trust what I'm going to do instead. That's the highlight that Walter says you got to look out for that, because she says that's a civil war. Now, here's the interesting thing. She was writing years before the US started to slip into some problems. And she was actually writing about African nations and Eastern European nations. She wasn't writing about the US. The interesting part of that is that the US seems to have had some of these issues in recent years. And she predicted that that was going to create levels of insurgency within the country. So her work on the Political Instability Task Force and her own book predicted some of the things that we have seen in recent time. The second issue that we have to worry about is factionalism. So again, it's not ethnic groups, it's not poverty, it's not corruption, it's not population size, it's factionalism. What that means is that teams start to form and the other team is portrayed as the enemy, as evil, as an other, right? And one that you can't get along with, right? And oftentimes these civil wars are waged over things like class or ideologies or ethnic groups But if those groups are based on identity-based politics, meaning if you're voting only on an identity, if you define yourself as a singular identity and you define yourself against another person's identity, right? I'm on the yellow team and they're on the purple team. I am therefore not purple. And I define myself as not being purple. When I start to do that, I have now slipped into true factionalism. And when factions become entrenched, that's when unrest really starts to fall apart. Now, the founding fathers actually warned against this, right? They warned against political parties, they warned against factions. They saw early on what factionalism would do. Unfortunately, they weren't able to keep it at bay. And we actually saw political parties arise in the second presidency. So it didn't take very long for factionalism to sort of take place, right? And so, but it's something that we have to think about how entrenched the factionalism becomes, right? Can parties or groups work across the aisle? Can they work together on ideas? Or do they believe the other group is better off not even existing, let alone being a part of the country? And if they're at that extreme and that radicalism, that's when things start to become very unstable, according to Walter. All right, so how do we stop this then? How do we stop a collapse? How do we stop a civil war? How do we stop this kind of unrest, right? How do we look at what Ferguson teaches us and Turchin and Easterly, right, and Diamond, how these theorists talk about where collapses have happened historically and geographically, and how can we look at that task force and Walter's work? How do we look at those and develop some solutions? Because it's fine and dandy to talk about all the terrible things that are going to happen, but we have a responsibility as a nation and as a civic nation and a civilized nation to try to fix these things, right? Okay, so how do we stop a collapse? Well, number one, first and foremost, and this is found by a lot of the theorists, but certainly emphasized by Walter, the elites must realize it is in their best interest to heal. So she actually looks at South Africa as a model for this in the 1980s, when there was a lot of political unrest and apartheid was alive and well. And what happened there was what everybody thought was on the brink of civil war in South Africa fizzled away because the wealthy business owners in South Africa realized a civil war would be costly for them, maybe cost them everything. And they realized that they had to choose between apartheid and big business or good business. They could not have both. They were not congruent ideas. And so they chose to end apartheid and maintain their businesses. And how they did that was they put a lot of pressure on the white minority leadership to expand rights to blacks in South Africa. And so the elites then have to realize it's in their best interest, financially, socially, and politically, to heal, right? Not to let civil war happen. That also means that social and political issues have to stop or when they start putting too much pressure on the economy, we have to realize, okay, we have to solve those social and political issues because they're putting too much pressure on the economy. And what's the most unifying factor of anybody living in a nation? It's how well the economy is doing. When the economy is doing well, that's good for both the elites and the peasantry or the proletariat, right? So you want the wealthy and the regular folks and the unwealthy to do well, and the only way to do that is have a strong, thriving economy. Okay. Another thing is that when external pressures start to kind of put pressure on a nation to heal itself and to not go into civil war, right? So, for an example, if there are economic sanctions from other countries put on a nation, that tends to help them heal, actually. So it seems kind of counterintuitive, but what it does is it helps mobilize people and realize they have to fix this, otherwise it's going to get worse. Again, we can use South Africa in the 80s as an example of this, when the US and Europe started putting pressure on South Africa and putting sanctions on them and saying, look, we're not going to deal with you economically until you get your country back in order. That kind of forced them to put their country back in order. Now, here's the biggest part that Walter talks about, and she says this is the huge issue. You remember back to her issues, she argues that it's a slip from democracy towards autocracy or autocracy slipping towards democracy that creates the instability, and then factionalism spawns from that. Well, the reason factionalism spawns for that is certainly tied into the things that Diamond talks about and some of our other theorists talk about when we talk about the social and cultural hallmarks of when a collapse is about to happen. a leader, oftentimes a politician or a religious leader, starts to use in and out group sort of ways of defining things. One way to talk about it is being an ethnic entrepreneur, meaning that you sense, look, there are these divided lines, ethnically, racially, religiously, whatever it is, and we can use that to our advantage, right? We can use that to help create followers. What ends up happening is very short-sighted. It's not a long-term plan, but what happens is, as a leader says, look, I see everything's really bad. I see that there's a lot of social and political unrest. I see that the economy is struggling, and I see that the elites have not made their decision yet to help. So here's what I'm going to tell you. It is the fault of this XYZ group. It's the fault of this other ethnic group. So why Walter kind of calls them ethnic entrepreneurs is because they're using this kind of like, I can seize this moment or take advantage of this moment and say, like, look, you've got these other differences. I'm going to wage them against one another, and I can use them to my advantage in order to say, if you're not, if you're, with them, you're against me, sort of thing, right? And so join me till you're against that other group. They're taking advantage of a terrible situation, and they're a really bad leader that has, kind of stoked the flames of unrest for their own personal gain. And if you don't see that early enough and you don't stop that early enough, Walter talks about how that puts you on a higher percentage or a higher ranking for a civil war. She also talks about that in the absence of a high level contrast, oftentimes one is fabricated. Again, so if you don't actually have like big ideological, economic, or political issues, ones become fabricated to help create difference, oftentimes by these leaders, these politicians, these religious leaders who are taking advantage of the situation, right? So what do these look like? Well, if a group really isn't that different from another group, right? It's often said in this country, we don't really have radicals in America. We just have right and left moderates, right? Really what that means is that, true radicalism is things like we see like in Rwanda, or we saw in Somalia, or saw in Yugoslavia, where it's like, armed massive conflict. Now, it doesn't mean we can't have that at some point. We obviously can. But at this point in history, we don't have that true radicalism. And truthfully, if you talk to average Americans, they tend to actually align in a lot of their values, right? There are actually a lot of compromises that can be had. But what's happened is our leaders on both sides have used the differences and continue to highlight those differences and try to showcase those differences in ways that are really, really drastic, and try to push us into more radical kind of versions of things and push us into more extremes in order to gain more support for themselves. They are taking advantage of a volatile situation, and they're becoming entrepreneurial in that way. The problem is it's very short-sighted, and it's only short-term. It doesn't last very long. Long-term solutions to these problems usually ask groups to come together, and that makes a lot of sense, right? So at the end of the day, to stop a collapse, we have to intervene in those moments that these theorists and these authors have talked about. We have to start thinking about things in different ways. One of the simplest ways to do that is to say two things. One, this country is strong and is based on democratic principles. If we continue to bolster those democratic principles, we're going to be okay. And two, look at the optimism, right? Not the pessimism. We all continue to speak the pessimism over and over and over again. It becomes part of our ethos. It becomes part of our culture. And the problem with that is it becomes a self-fulfilling prophecy, right? And then leaders are going to take advantage of us when we do that. Instead, we should be very optimistic. We should say, we're going through a terrible time right now. Things are very difficult economically and socially and politically, but we're Americans. We're going to get through. We've gotten through before. We've gotten through really hard times before, and we found ways to come together and compromise. We found ways to come together and find solutions that help everyday Americans do well and thrive in this country.